Hello everybody, and you're very welcome to a new episode of Redefining Cybersecurity here on ITSP Magazine Podcast Network. This is Sean Martin, your host, and I'm coming to you kind of live from the show floor at Infosecurity Europe 2023 in London, Excel. And I have the pleasure of chatting with Chris Thorpe today from Quest. We're going to be looking at operational resilience, AD resilience, and what that means to the business. Chris, thanks for joining me.
Okay, thank you. Just to explain a little bit about my role at Quest, I'm the UK and Ireland Technical Channel Manager, so I work with our partners across the whole, all of the different verticals that we have, and we work together to deliver IT cyber resiliency from an Active Directory perspective to our customers. So we tend to provide the software, and our partners provide the consultancy and the services and the managed services to help them to deploy it and then to manage the various different solutions that we have.
So let's start with this, Chris, because I think, AD, there's on-premises, there's in the cloud, there's certainly Azure AD. As organizations are either maintaining or migrating and transforming those environments, what are some of the paths that they need to be familiar with in terms of where bad things can happen, either from an external, it could be an employee, it could be a partner, it could be... So talk to me about some of the paths.
That's a great question. So if we think about AD, it's actually 23 years old in its current form. It's been various sort of iterations, but the fundamentals of it haven't really changed since the late 90s. Before that it was NT4, user management, and then it morphed into Active Directory. So in IT terms, it's very old, and the principles that are behind it are still the same. And what we see is that a lot of people now, it's not a sexy product, it's there, it lets people log into their laptops and connects to them and authenticates what they need to do. But from that perspective, it's an absolutely prime target for hackers and cybersecurity and cyber threats. Because if somebody can get in with a standard Active Directory account, they can basically look for the various different paths to take it from a standard account or to find a route through to getting through to the tier 0 assets. And the tier 0 assets are obviously the most important parts of the company. They're the domain controllers, they're the databases, they're where the data and the contents are stored. So Active Directory actually manages the permissions and access to those different areas. So if they get the access as a domain admin to Active Directory, they've got the keys to the kingdom. Yeah. And so in terms of how people get to that, it is, they try and compromise an account, or we've seen organisations go through a merger, and instead of doing a full assessment of the source environment being brought in, they basically do, we haven't got a lot of time, we'll just do a lift and shift and we'll take everything across. And that can take across old vulnerabilities, old SID histories, old permissions that people have for users that have left the organisation, but those permissions are still there. And they can basically resurrect those old accounts and basically start to do damage off the back of that, and nobody really sees that happening because AD itself is quite difficult to interrogate. It's an old form of environment. He uses the sysvol, and he uses the domain controllers to do all of the authentication, so it's very difficult to see what's happening unless you have specialist tools to help you to manage it.
So many questions in my head here, because a lot of my experience with AD was back in the old days. I built a SIM using OpenLDAP because we didn't want to tie directly to AD. But
it's exactly that sort of principle where we'll keep the old the OpenLDAP available because we don't know what applications are still using it. So if we turn it off and people start shouting, we immediately turn it back on, but we don't do any investigation as to, or maybe we should update those applications or replace them, or find something better that's more secure. It's a case of, because AD is so vital to everything, if we make a misconfiguration or we make a change that stops half of the company working, each hour that you're down is costing the company potentially tens or even hundreds of thousands of pounds, and it stops everybody working, and that's, it's a key definition of that. It's a single point of failure for the organisation. And even if you think about moving to the cloud and using Azure AD, the principles are exactly the same. People will try and get in on an Azure AD path, and you go, well, I've got MFA, it's all fine. What we did with working with some of our white hat hackers, they did some pen testing for our customers, and they were actually calling the AD admins at 2 o'clock in the morning and saying you need to press your authentication, you need to do your authentication on your device to capture that. So they would spoof the MFA process. The AD admin, because it's 2 o'clock in the morning, all they want to do is sleep, push through the MFA authorization, and their spoof basically captured the token. Then they go in as that admin, and they've got the full token rights because they've been given the MFA token. And with that, you don't even need to log in. You don't need a password. You don't need anything. You have the token, and they go straight in, and they can cause a huge amount of damage in a very short time. So that's the kind of complexity that we're dealing with now. We've also seen emails be sent into people, and inside of that email is spoofed to look like it's coming from the HR team, and it says in there, we have recently changed your contract's terms and conditions. Please click on the link to see your updated T's and C's for your contract. If I see that as an end user, I'm going to be clicking on that link. So, with the advent of ChatGPT, they're using that to craft really intelligent emails that attack people's fears and concerns. And this is a personal email. It's, you're on the list. Your contract's been changed. What do you mean it's been changed? Why? What am I going to do here? And so they click on that link, and it's really, the levels of sophistication now, and gone are the days where you get, some rubbish email coming through with no resemblance with just an attachment. They're actually crafting it to hone in on people's fears and uncertainties, and using that as a method to gain access to that.
So there are two different views here, perhaps. One is access to an account. So they compromise, gain access to an account, and then understanding the role and the privileges and the access to different things, and perhaps how to gain escalated levels of privilege. That's one view. And then the other is, I've accessed AD, and I can see all the stuff, and then can kind of figure out how and where I want to move. Even if I don't have access to all the accounts, I can see the map, if you will, of the organization. How do some of the conversations go with your customers, either directly or with some of your partners, to uncover what needs to be dealt with there?
Well, we take the viewpoint that assume accounts have already been compromised. And so, you're always going to get attack paths coming through. Within Active Directory, you're changing people's roles every day, you're changing their permissions. Quite often you're adding the roles and they're adding the permissions, but you very rarely take them away again because you don't know exactly what the different groups are, the different permissions are. And if somebody's been with an organisation for a number of years, they just gradually accumulate lots of permissions because they've been into different areas. So we say to people, look, assume there's been a compromise. But then when we examine the attack paths, typically they will lead up to a choke point where you may have, if you've got an organisation of 5,000 users, you may have 5,000 users, you may have a couple of thousand groups, you may have all of these different areas of concern. But they typically lead up to an area just before the tier 0 assets that all congregate into a single point. So our philosophy is, accept that maybe the lower areas of that attack path have been compromised, but if you can stop them at the choke points, and you can block the access at there and block their ability to make changes at that point, you are protecting the environment from that you're protecting your tier 0 assets, which is what you need to manage. And so that's where that attack path management comes in. It's also where things like audit trails are really important, because you can then if you see unusual activity occurring in the organisation, you can say, okay, we can see people trying to escalate through because there's changes being made. If I can track that back to the original source point, I can find the area of compromise. If I can do that, then I can maybe restore that particular account, remove the compromise, and get it back to a known good account, or I can just delete it. I can block it, and I can recreate the user based on a backup that I can recreate them as a different user, but they still have the right permissions. So it's a combination of factors that you need to understand, is those attack paths, controlling the choke points, making sure that no unauthorized changes happen in the environment. You maybe set up a change control window with a couple of accounts that are allowed to make those changes. Outside of that window, those accounts are disabled, so that nobody else can make those changes, and only within that, say a 3-hour window on a Thursday afternoon, we can make changes that are approved, that are signed off, that have gone through change control. The rest of the time, everything's locked down. Right. And then you can maybe raise a major incident change control if you need to, but you have your set paths and processes, and people in the admin areas know that those are the situations that they're going through, so that if something unusual happens outside of that change control window, it's immediately rejected and rolled back, and people, the attackers are thwarted at that point.
So talk to me, as you're describing these scenarios, I'm picturing an AD admin team that all they care about is giving access to the people they're yelling and screaming, right?
Yep.
That I need access to that stuff. And then there's probably, I don't know, this is what I kind of want to get a feel from you for, is there somebody on the team that's responsible for looking at it from a risk and misconfiguration and a vulnerability and a resilient perspective? Or is that somebody outside that's trying to then influence or control things? Yeah. So talk about that relationship.
Well, that's it, and that is part and parcel of having a properly structured joiners, movers and leavers process. So as part of that, you say, okay, well, if anybody is in the HR department, they need to be members of these groups. So you have it all based back to a group-based structure. So they're members of those groups. That then happens, and you manage the groups, and you use an automated process to add people into the groups and to take them out, so that you're not adding individual users or adding permissions to an individual user. You're always using the group process. What you also need to be able to do is try and, if you have nested groups are a nightmare within AD, because if you do a standard AD report, it just says, this is the group, these are the users that are in that group, and there's this group that also has access. But it doesn't tell you who's in that subgroup. And so those nested groups can contain a whole multitude of sins, where you have groups coming in and out of those different areas. So part of that automation and creation of a true joiners, movers and leavers process is you kind of map every position that you have in an organisation to the permissions that they need to have, and so you can automate it. So if you say, John leaves the IT department and he's gone for a change in career and he's moved to the HR, as part of that move, you remove all of his IT access and just grant him for the HR access. And so that's how you reduce the sprawl, you contain everything, and you make sure that if somebody is screaming about permissions, you go, well, you've got access to these groups, why do you need access to this suddenly? Right. If there's a change control, you need to have this, we need to have that business justification as to why you suddenly need access to something different. And we will then create a new group, we'll put you in, and then we'll add that into the process, so that the next time somebody moves into that role, that permission is already accounted for and it gets added automatically. So, it's a fairly complex thing to set up to start with, but once it's done and once it's in place, it reduces the stress for your average AD admin and IT admin, because quite often you don't see a lot of AD admins as a standalone role anymore. They are M365 admins that also do the Active Directory. It's not unless it's a large organisation, people don't tend to specialise in AD anymore.
Right.
It's not sexy. People don't want to move into AD.
Right. Yeah, I completely understand that. And so as we start to wrap here, I think the theme of the show is to rethink, right? And I think Quest is rethinking things a little bit in the sense of the VM environments that you're setting up. So talk to me a little bit about what's going on there and how that kind of helps companies.
So most organisations now have used a virtual machine model. You know, the size and the power of virtual machines now and the physical hardware means that you can run multiple servers on that physical hardware, or you're moving into Azure, Azure as an Azure VM, or AWS, or any one of a multitude of other cloud providers. But the principle of that is a domain controller is a very specialist piece of hardware, and being able to do a snapshot of a VM from an AD perspective, that does not guarantee that you have a backup of your Active Directory. It just backs up the VM. Now, as anybody who knows, if you try and restore a VM from 3 months ago into your AD today, it's just going to throw up a whole bunch of errors going, why are you trying to connect from me when the last image that I have with this, you're 3 months out of date, you're immediately suspect, I'm not going to talk to you, all of the metadata, all of the sysvol is out of date. It looks worse than it did before, so you're now out of the loop. So if you're imagining that happening to all of your domain controllers and they're all being restored from a time 3 months previously, they're all going to be going, well, you're not valid, you're not recognised, you're not a true AD domain controller in this forest, therefore I'm going to block you. And so they all cascade down. You know, they may start to speak and communicate initially, but if you have a password policy that says change every 60 days and you restore it for 90 days, boom, everything fails. It goes, your password is incorrect. So it can cause a huge amount of problems there. So, we did a report with Forrester, and they basically said that trying to do a native restore of your Active Directory manually can take you up to 10 days. So if you imagine nobody can log into your environment for 10 days, what kind of impact that would have in your business? You really need to be considering an automated recovery tool for your Active Directory, which is separate from your VM snapshots, your content backup tools, your server backup software, because Active Directory is a specialist product, and it needs a specialist restore tool. Now, obviously, Quest supply one. There are other companies out there, but you really need to think about that as a specialist solution and something to complement your normal content backup and your normal server backups.
Yeah, and it strikes me that it requires specialist solutions.
Yes.
Yet there are fewer specialists available.
This is it. We're not trying to replace Veeam. We're not trying to replace the big boys in the that big content backup area. What we say is we complement those solutions by looking at specific specialist tools like Active Directory and saying we can back this up and we can restore it, and we can restore it within 4 to 6 hours instead of that 10-day downtime. It may even be less than that because we have a lot of capabilities in there.
Yeah. Well, Chris, you've made me rethink AD today.
Thank you.
So
that's all we ask.
I appreciate that, and hopefully our listeners are thinking differently as well. And check out quest.com to learn more, and we'll include some links in the show notes to connect with you, Chris, and the rest of the team. So thanks everybody for listening, and good luck with the rest of the show.
Yep. Thanks for your time, everyone.